go ahead and call the roll.
Councilmember Cormack.
Here.
Chair Du Bois.
Here.
Vice Mayor Fine.
Here.
3 present.
Great. So this is the Finance Committee, June 18th. I don't think we have any oral communications, so we'll proceed right to action item number 1.
Good evening, Finance Committee. For action item 1, we actually don't have a staff presentation. It's just an informational report to the committee on the third quarter financials. So staff's here if the committee has any questions. Otherwise, yeah, we're here to help.
Good evening again. So I'm assuming that our third quarter is usually the weakest sales quarter for property tax revenue. Is that just consistent from a seasonal standpoint?
Yes, I think that that's correct, just because of the timing of the revenues coming in and how it's due in December and April.
Okay, and then I was interested in the information on the TOT tax. How actually do the collections work? What is the process for that?
Good evening. My name is Tara Narayan. I'm the Manager of Treasury, Debt and Investments. Just to clarify, are you talking about in terms of timing of when the hotels, are supposed to remit, things like that?
Timing and process.
Okay.
It was just referenced. It was referenced that the process. There was some reference to the process, and I was just curious about how the collections work. It was talking about timing of collections, and then that prompted just a broader question.
Yes, so typically we'll get payment on a monthly basis. At the end of each month, the hotels have up to 30 days to submit their payments to us. Typically a lot of them will submit at the latter end of that timeline. By the time the city gets it, it might take a week or two for us to process it. So there's about maybe a week and a half. If they're late, it's up to 2 months in terms of a delay between when the collection occurred on a particular month versus when we actually get the receipt.
Great. And about how many hotels do we have in Palo Alto?
About 30. Then we have Airbnb and Expedia online type of portals in addition to that, and some minor miscellaneous.
Okay. And Airbnb also remits every month?
Yes. The online as well as the physical hotels all are required to submit on a monthly basis.
Okay. Probably not the time to talk about how Airbnb works, but I'll just say that I'm definitely interested in understanding a little bit more about any checks we can do. I know it's, a common question in the community. Are we really getting everything we should from Airbnb?
Well, one of the things we're currently doing is we have an RFP out for multiple, both sales tax, TOTs, things like that. We got 2 results. We're still evaluating it, and one of the things we'll be looking at is engaging an external provider to potentially do audits on a rotating basis.
Great. Thank you so much. And let's see if there's anything else. That was all I had.
Just really quickly, the Wayfair decision, you reference increase in California sales tax of $550 million. I assume that's statewide, right?
Correct.
Okay, thanks.
Sweet. That would have been so nice.
Still seems pretty low.
So it seems like overall, year to date, we're 2% ahead. I mean, is there anything that gives you concern in terms of either expenses or revenue as we finish out the year?
No, right now things are tracking, obviously some things are tracking above estimates, some things are tracking below estimates, but overall we are tracking within budgeted estimates, so we aren't anticipating any overall issues.
Okay. And then could you just spend a second on the budget stabilization reserve, given some of the conversation last night?
Sure. Our budget stabilization reserve by council policy is supposed to be within a range of 15 to 20% of general fund expenses. So staff analyzes that as part of budget as part of the budget adoption every year, and they also look at it, obviously, when we reconcile our funds at the end of a fiscal year. And right now, we are frankly above the council's approved target level of 18.5%. And so beyond that, it's council's discretion in terms of how to spend additional funds. But right now, we're within council policy and
Yeah.
at the target.
And just to confirm what I heard last night, I mean, we're talking about rolling over unused amounts. It wasn't that we were $18 million spending out of reserve.
The conversation last night was talking about spending out of reserves, and the 2020 financial, our budget does anticipate use of some reserves, but it's in the enterprise funds. So we have various reserves in our enterprise funds which function like a business, that help stabilize things like rates or capital investments. And so, the reserves by design are intended to be drawn upon to help smooth, the business fluxes.
But the general fund reserve,
Is not being used for budget balancing purposes for FY19 or 20.
right, okay. I just wanted to confirm that. I'm
Yeah,
not sure
no,
that came
you're-
across
you're
last
good.
night. Cool. Anything else? All right, let's move on to item number 2. I do have a couple of public speakers. Do you need a motion on this?
Sure, just to
Just to accept it.
approve and accept the financial report.
I'll move approval and acceptance of the third quarter financial report of fiscal year 2019.
Second, all in favor?
Aye.
Great. Thanks for that. Okay, so item number 2 is a preliminary review of a consideration of a ballot measure. Why don't we go to the members of the public first, or would you like to present first? Go ahead.
Cool. So just a couple introductions for this evening, since we have new players at the table. Tonight, as you mentioned, we're looking at preliminary revenue estimates. This is one aspect of the 2019 fiscal sustainability work plan that the committee as well as the council approved. Christine is the Assistant Director in Administrative Services and has been helping work on this project. And Doug is our consultant for sales tax. And frankly, Doug is a wealth of information. So we really asked him here to provide some context as we start these conversations associated with taxes and potential revenue measures. So pick his brain in terms of his experience. How many years of experience? 28? Dang. So 28 years of experience and a great wealth of information. So we just we asked him to be here to help the conversation if the committee has any additional questions. Okay, so moving right along into the presentation. Just setting some context for this evening. In the staff's memo, basically articulate. Oh. So really, we are looking to have the committee kind of look at these potential tax measures, frankly, and any information or prioritization that the committee can do to help focus staff's analysis would be really helpful. Before you are informational, high-level framing. They're rough estimates to start putting dollars and magnitudes to potential revenue-generating measures or ballot measures, tax measures, and to help frame a more focused conversation per the work plan in the fall. So really do need to stress, these are not detailed, we don't have, frankly, all the information. So there are a lot of caveats and assumptions with all the numbers that are presented here tonight. Beyond the just helping focus, where to focus staff's analysis is, obviously we have a rail working group that starts meeting tomorrow, I believe. And, the committee as a whole is going to need to have some level of understanding as to what the bond financing feasibility is as they look at the preferred alternatives. So any kind of discussion over the baseline assumptions for them. And then lastly, obviously direction to proceed and refine these estimates. We would return in the fall, and we'll also conduct stakeholder outreach, polling, et cetera, as necessary. So again, tonight is step one. It's kind of starting to set the tone. So really think of it as an informational, educational framework session. Okay. Beyond that, basics, Prop 218 regulates California taxes. So a general tax, it must be approved by a simple majority of voters, and it has to be put at a regular general election, our next one being November 2020. A special tax, which is for a specific purpose, must be approved by a 2/3 majority, or supermajority, I'm sorry, of voters, so that's 66.67%. Typically, you'll see things like parcel taxes or bonds that are for specific initiatives or specific expenses. There's been some discussion, and there's what's called a citizen initiative, and that right now follows Proposition 218, with the exception of it having to be placed on a regular general election, meaning it can be placed on a special election. There is currently litigation with San Francisco that is exploring whether or not the majority versus supermajority is the rule, so to speak, in terms of special taxes. You probably know more about that than I do. Any other, am I missing?
Can't really add more to that.
Perfect. So we're watching the legislation, or not the legislation, I'm sorry, we're watching the court case, but it's something that's to be cognizant of. And then the last piece is sales tax, or taxes that appear before voters in California. So we'll be going through basically all of these taxes except for a vehicle registration fee this evening. So something, as we've been talking about ballot measures, that was really helpful when we're talking with Doug, just getting his context. He provided this nice little acronym, EASE. So I'll give the mic to Doug to kind of walk us through ways to evaluate.
Good evening. Doug Jensen, Senior Vice President of Avenue Insights and Analytics, and we work for about 1,200 cities nationwide and over 240 throughout California, 28 years as a local tax specialist. There's lots of different tax principles dating back to the 1850s. I won't take you that far back. But we've kind of streamlined it. We like the acronym EASE, so it stands for Equity, Administratability, Stability, and Economic Benefit. So basically, it's the four major principles of tax policy, if you will. Equity is the ability to structure a tax, or the desire to structure a tax where it's equitable among all residents and businesses. Local revenue options for municipalities in California is pretty limited. We saw the slide before. So each of those can walk through this tax principle, if you will, and say which ones are easy to meet these principles. The methods of taxation have been around since the Roman Empire, I suppose, and that's three basic methods. It's you can tax wealth, you can tax income, and you can tax consumption. Is basically the basic methods. The equity is important to keep in mind in terms of total tax contribution. There's certain industries, for example, high power consumers pay a lot more in utilities or tax. Auto dealers and shopping centers generate a lot of sales tax, so you want to make sure you keep the overall tax burden equitable. For example, businesses that are portable, right? They're generating a lot of either utility tax or sales tax or property tax. You don't want to overburden the tax on any particular group. Otherwise, they can easily relocate. The administratability is basically looking at a tax type that is simple. Keep it as simple as possible to administer. Keep it as simple as possible for the businesses to comply. We've seen a lot of tax structures around the state that get incredibly complicated. Some of them, for example, the conversation in Sacramento about changing the vehicle license fees and how we raise money to pay for roads is to do a tax per mile driven. Sounds like a great idea. Incredibly difficult to administer. All the self-reporting and going through the DMV. Stability, obviously you want a tax type that's going to be relatively stable. Quite honestly, though, nearly all tax types have some level of volatility, right? We're taxing income, wealth, or consumption, and those always fluctuate with the economy. But with that volatility, you'll see large revenue growth from time to time. For example, your real property transfer tax or your documentary transfer tax when housing markets and real estate's very high, you get a high revenue from that tax type, and when things are low, it can fluctuate very widely. And then finally, the economic benefits. You know, is the tax efficient? Does it promote economic development policies and objectives? Does it have minimal disruption of taxpayers? And really, you know, the economic benefits at a good tax policy is that the taxes go to public services that the citizenry wants, and that is a mutual benefit in that tax. I've seen in California, in my career, a very large propensity of local voters will vote yes on local measures. Then, for example, in California, there's over 280 cities out of the 480 cities that have successfully adopted a sales tax measure. And they understand the economic benefits that it's going to promote, you know, a high quality of living. And I think, you know, a well-structured tax type could meet all of those principles.
Thank you, Doug. Okay, so moving on through the various taxes and the potential measures for them. Just to kind of setting the stage along with Doug's principle of ease, you know, the ecosystem of a local economy, there are multiple players in it. Everyone has a role and everyone is contributing. So you have your residents, you've got businesses and commercial as well as visitors. So one of the things to consider, as Doug had mentioned, as part of that ease philosophy is who is contributing to the tax base and making sure that there's some level of equitability across that. So first are property taxes, and what you will see is dense slides as we go through this. And the point of this is really to provide context, data and information to the committee so that you can understand different ways of looking at the revenues, trends in the revenues, who's paying the various taxes, and what the burdens are. So on this slide, we're really talking about property taxes. And so bear in mind, property taxes are the annual bill that people will see, whether it's commercial or residential, is a general tax levy, any voter-approved bonded indebtedness repayments, as well as special district assessments. So a lot of what we're looking at on this slide is the general tax levy portion of it. And so if you look at the top left, you can see the assessed value versus parcel count. There's quantity of parcels as part of property tax, but property tax is based on the assessed value of the property. So you may have a larger quantity of one type of parcel or another, but it's the value of those parcels that the tax is assessed on. So that green bar is what the tax is assessed on. The orange bar are the quantity of parcels. Moving over to the right, secured property tax, taxable value. So just kind of looking.
May I interrupt for just a minute?
Of course.
Can you explain the axes then?
I'm sorry, percentage of our total assessed value as a city.
Okay. And then on the right, it says dollars in billions.
Correct. So going over to the far right section that's for the axes on of the blue graph, and that is our taxable value. And the value that we're being taxed for property tax is in the billions. Yep, sorry, we shoved a lot of information on one slide. And what this is showing is overall, and this is across all parcels, our assessed value as a organization, as a city, as jurisdiction, has grown about 45% since 2014. And so that's, you know, we all see it with the median home prices going up with the turnover rates. And so part of this, though, embeds property tax law. So there's Prop 13. And Prop 13 caps the growth of your assessed value, and it's reassessed at certain points in time. So oftentimes we've heard things like how many parcels are under $600,000 as an assessed value in the city. We're at about 35%, and previously that was at about 40%. So as properties turn, the value is reassessed, which helps with that 45% growth. You don't have that kind of growth without things like turnover or increases in square footage, a new asset, a new property that you would be assessing a tax on, because Prop 13 caps your annual assessed value growth at 2%. So I'm trying to think if I've forgotten anything. The other turnover piece, actually, that we should probably clarify as we talk about turnover is not just the transition of a piece of property, a sale of a property, but it's also when a long-term lease comes up. So oftentimes in businesses or larger, I'll call them parcels, you'll do long-term leases. Long-term leases are 20 years plus. When a long-term lease comes up for renewal, the property is reassessed at that time, almost like a transfer of the property, even though it's not necessarily a transfer, they've just changed leases. So that assessed valuation becomes a major factor of property tax growth for cities. And for us in Palo Alto, almost 50% of our growth in property tax is because of what I'm going to call turnover. Doesn't necessarily mean, again, that the title is changing, but whether it's a lease or a transaction. The secured property tax below kind of gives an outline of kind of who pays and where it goes. Property tax, all of the money doesn't go to the city. In fact, only about 9% of it comes to the city. The rest of it goes to school districts, as well as the county, and then ERAF for the state. So we're a rather small portion. In the chart below, something that I think the council and the committee have seen before, looks at residential versus commercial secured property tax, what their total tax bill would be for the general tax levy, and then what the city would be receiving from a contribution standpoint. And you can kind of see that discrepancy in terms of turnover rate when you look at the median contribution versus the average. Right? You have some properties that are really low in their assessed value, and you have some properties that are really high in that assessed value. Things to consider, or rather note, it doesn't require increases in square footage for your value of an asset to go up. For example, go back to that 20-year long-term lease. Obviously, hopefully, your value of your property has increased over 20 years, and so whether or not you add square footage doesn't necessarily demand or drive the price. If you redevelop that property, obviously, tenant improvements are going to increase the value of the asset so that it's not a 20 or 30-year-old building. And keep in mind, as those things happen, other taxes can be generated depending on the use of the facility. For example, development fees are paid, right? If you're going to do a major development on a commercial property, your average development fees are somewhere between about $100,000 to $300,000. Depending on who is going to occupy that building is going to drive things like your utility user tax as well as your sales tax. As Doug mentioned, you have a big company that's using a lot of energy, they're going to drive utility user taxes because of the electricity that they are consuming in order to operate their business. You have a business that is producing a widget, and the point of sale is where their headquarters are. That's actually going to drive sales tax, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So we are not allowed to change the general tax levy, that's state. However, we are able to do different types of taxes like parcel tax, which is not going to be based on the value of the property, but it would be based on something like square footage. Okay, sales tax. Again, with all of the charts. Sales tax. Sales tax is about 9%, not about, is 9% in Palo Alto, and Palo Alto receives 1% of that 9%. And I probably should go from the left to the right, like again. So starting with sales tax by economic segments, those are the segments that we report out sales tax. So sales tax is taxed on uses or goods, so to speak. The advent of internet has totally changed the landscape of sales tax as it continues to morph, hence the Wayfair case that's come down. But this tax used to be based on brick and mortar. So a storefront, you sell someone a pencil, and there's a tax associated with that. But as we move to a different type of community that is consuming services as opposed to goods, think your subscriptions, this tax is not necessarily set up to capture the new business trends that we as a community are seeing, frankly, due to technology. The bottom right graph is looking at sales tax rate by jurisdiction. So as I mentioned, Palo Alto is at 9%, which is that green bar. We do have the ability to do a quarter-cent tax increase. So that would be a 0.25 increase, bringing our rate to 9.25, which is about 4.5 million in additional revenue annually. It would be a district tax specifically for the city of Palo Alto, similar to what other jurisdictions like Campbell, Los Gatos, and San Jose have done. It could be a general tax, or it could be a special tax. That would be a decision, a policy call that the council could make. Then on the upper right is the annual sales tax by region. So again, looking at not only what economic segments are driving that tax, but where in our Palo Alto's jurisdiction, where are tax revenues coming from that generate sales tax? Obviously, the biggest one being Stanford Shopping Mall. So with the shopping center, that is the old model of sales tax in terms of brick and mortar and people consuming goods. But you can see the second largest is University Avenue, as well as Stanford Research Park. So University Avenue, you're going to have things like retail, you're going to have restaurants, which all have sales tax. But if you think about the Stanford Research Park, it makes you sit down and think, what is generating that sales tax in the research park? It's not full of businesses that are selling widgets in terms of a storefront. There are not a ton of restaurants in the research park. The research park has points of sale. So one of our top 25, I think, sales tax generators are Tesla, Nest, Bon Appetit, which does their catering for companies typically. Usually universities or larger companies use them for catering. So those are why you see sales tax coming from Stanford Research Park. So not only the kind of business, but not only that it is not a brick and mortar storefront, but the type of business that's there. For example, I think Nest has left.
That's correct. So that's a loss of revenue to the
Correct.
city.
So we will most likely potentially see that orange column, which is 2018, Stanford Research Park, adjust over the coming year, unless another business that has a widget that's being sold replaces them. But that's a finite group. So this is kind of sales tax in a nutshell. TOT. I won't spend a ton of time on this since we have talked ad nauseum in this organization and community about transient occupancy tax. Our rate is currently 15.5%, with the voters recently approving a 1.5% rate increase. Just for information, a 0.5 increase in the rate to 16% would be about $900,000 in additional revenue. And then just to orient the public to the chart below, on the axis on the left, you're looking at dollars in millions, and what that's measuring is the annual TOT receipts that are collected. The axis on the right is looking at your occupancy rates. So how full are our hotels? The red bars are looking at tax measure changes, and I think we're actually missing one in there in 2014, if I remember correctly. Yep, we're missing a bar in 2014, apologies. 2015, thank you, Taryn, where we did the 2% rate increase. The yellow boxes are the average room rates for those years. So you can kind of see the revenue versus your room rates versus your occupancy rates, which are all drivers associated with how this tax is calculated, frankly. Okay, utility user tax. Really, we did a measure change here to change our telephone user tax. And what stood out to me as we were looking at this historically is how much our telephone utility user tax has grown. These are consumption-based taxes, as Doug, to bring it back to that ease concept. So as you consume more of these, you will be taxed more. What we did with the newest telephone tax is we modernized it, and so updated it for the new technologies, frankly. And it's proven really effective. Since 2015 to 2018, telephone tax has grown about 85%, whereas you look at electric and gas, those have grown about 16% since 2015.
That doesn't include internet data, correct?
If it's bundled,
Yeah.
it's taxed. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, so utility tax will apply to telecommunications if it's bundled into a package.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So it's on the total? Thank you.
Since we are our utility provider, I can't break out kind of the user base for the telephone, especially with bundling of services. And when companies are remitting it, I can't tell from Verizon if it is from a personal account versus a business account. But since we run our own utility, we can run our ratepayers and who pays into our utilities. So looking at the electric, water, and gas utilities, depending on the year, you can kind of see the makeup of who's making who's paying the rates, frankly, as a business. And so on electric, you can see a lion's share of the rates are generated from the commercial side of things. And, you think large companies, tech companies, you've got massive server farms that require a ton of energy and HVAC. Then you move to water, which is a primarily residential area, just for your showers, your agriculture, or lawns and yards, et cetera. And then gas is split about 50-50. And those utilities, in order of magnitude, in terms of dollar size, electric is the largest, then gas, and then water.
Quick question.
Sure.
These percentages are the number of customers or the amount of the tax they're paying?
The value, correct,
Okay,
the
thank
amount,
you.
not the number. Yes. Since it is consumption-based, yeah, all of these figures are going to be based on the value as opposed to the number. Something just to keep in mind as we look at the utility user tax and that rate base in terms of who's paying the rates for these commodities. The city also has an equity transfer from our utilities, so that's something else to consider because that equity transfer is about $20 million between gas and electric that's coming to the general fund. Although not a tax, it is built into the rates that these customer bases are paying. Okay, documentary transfer tax. Probably the most volatile of our taxes. DTT is when you change hands of a parcel, and you can see the tax rate is made up of two components: the county rate as well as the city rate. Our city rate is $3.30 per $1,000 of property value. So what we could do to generate additional revenue, if the council wanted to, would be increase that $3.30. And just for orders of magnitude, it would at $1.10 per thousand would be about 2.8 million. What's most important is that 2.8 million annually is based on about 9 million in total of this tax. And if you look at the graph that's before you, that's where we're currently trending. So we did it based on 2018's revenue estimates, but this is not steady, let's just put it that way. If you look at 2008, 2009, you can see the significant drops in these taxes. It's very volatile and can be impacted not only by recessions, but also kind of where development's at within communities. Okay, business tax. We don't have a business tax, but we have a business registry program. And so what we wanted to lay out are what some other jurisdictions are doing in the business tax realm to provide some context to the committee. These are really high-level math assumptions, to be honest. Since we don't have a business tax and our business registry, we recognize that the data is incomplete and are working on bolstering that database. But in the absence of that, staff's looked at various census data as well as real estate data and modeled two potential revenues that could be generated if we modeled them based off of measures that were recently passed in neighboring jurisdictions. So the first one is a headcount tax. Mountain View recently approved a headcount tax, and it at max reaches $150 per employee. What's important to note is when we did the 14.6 million estimate, we took the number of jobs estimated in Palo Alto based on the census, which is about 97,000, and multiplied that by 150 and magically got that revenue estimate. There's no assumptions associated with exemptions. There's no assumptions associated with scaling the tax, whether it's 1 to 100 employees, 100 employees to 1,000 employees, 1,000 to 5,000 employees. Mountain Views has a tiered tax system, and in your memo, there's the actual tier structure associated with it. The second one that staff modeled was East Palo Alto. They actually ended up doing a parcel tax on commercial property, which is assessed on square footage that is greater than 25,000. I don't have data necessarily right now on how much commercial parcels we have, how many commercial parcels we have that are over 25,000 square feet. So what we did is we looked at CoStar, looked at how much office, and their qualification for office is Class A, B, and C office space. We have about 12 million square feet of office space, and assessed the $2.50 per square foot tax that East Palo Alto leveraged, and that generates about 30 million. Again, this is not scaled for 25,000 square feet or more. This is all 12 million square feet of office space.
That's $2.50 a square foot a year.
Correct. Correct. And on average, our office space, same database, CoStar, is a little over $6 per square foot per month. And no, that's an aggregate. That's Class A, B, and C.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
Kylie, can you just go over that again? So the current cost is about 6,
Correct. So it's the current cost for, based on the CoStar data, is about a little over $6 per square foot per month. That's the average across all classes of office space. So you've got the high end to the low end. And so $6.50 per square foot per month. This tax would be assessed $2.50 per square foot annually.
So $78 a year. Sorry.
it would be an increase of close to, in terms of a percentage.
Oh.
If it's currently 6, and it
Six
would,
per month, so it's like $6.50 a month, is like 70.
20 cents on 650.
Yeah.
But
Right, it would be, your annual rent would be about $75 per square foot per year.
just jumping in, I mean, 650 is low. If you call around, you're getting $10 a square foot per month, if not more.
Correct. It's about 3%.
that's the number I was looking for. Thank you.
Got it. Sorry, I was not quite sure where we're going.
Sorry, I wasn't being
That's okay.
articulate.
Yep, so your annual rent, assuming $75 per square foot, it's about 3% on that. Again, with that caveat though, we just took the 12 million times the $2.50 square feet. East Palo Alto segregated that it was only office space that was 25,000 square feet or above. Okay, other variables for consideration. Units of measure, obviously we've gone through 2, head count and gross square footage. The third typical unit of measure is gross receipts. San Francisco has a gross receipts as well as a payroll tax. And most recently, San Francisco did I think the most recent was the homeless Measure C, if I remember. That is supposed to generate about 300 million. That's what that 300 million estimate is there. All of these definitions or all of these measures have lots to them. And so one of the things that the council, if chosen to go down this path, will need to consider is, frankly, the definition of all of these units, depending on which one, if the council so chose to go down that path. We have a unique business climate here. You've got startups. We have lots of remote or telecommuting. We have lots of contractors. And those are just workforce changes that are going on throughout the community, not just Palo Alto, but in the valley, frankly. The other thing to look at would be scaling, obviously, like we talked about. Would you change the rate based on size? Whether it be headcount, whether it be square footage, or whether it be gross receipts, you could phase, depending on thresholds, the rate of taxation. As Doug mentioned, cost of administration. Business taxes can be very expensive to administer if they are complex. And so as an organization weighs whether or not to have a business tax or to change a business tax, one of the major things that should be considered are, what does it take to actually implement it? What data is available? What data is verifiable? And how do you enforce it? And so all of those things play into the first three bullets, which is what's your unit of measure, how do you define it, and are you scaling it or not? And then the last piece is going to be exemptions that, and these are variables for consideration. These are not all the variables out there, but these are some of the main ones to consider. Do you have a hardship clause? Do you have a local or small business clause? Do you have a nonprofit clause? You look at San Francisco because they want to generate certain industries. They will have exemptions or breaks for certain industries that they want to attract businesses in those specific areas.
Just quickly, how would you apply those on a real estate tax? I mean, let's say we wanted to do the square footage tax,
Sure.
but exempt nonprofits. Is that possible, or is that just hard to administer in that you're actually speaking to the business or the property owner and saying, are you
I'm going to
hosting?
argue mixing those two variables would be very difficult.
Okay, that's actually answers my question. And then on the hardship, I mean, what would that be? Like your business was in the red this year, or?
There are a number of different hardship clauses. You could do it based on size, you could do it based on your P&L, you could, it just depends on the clauses that you so choose.
You do small business
Yeah.
exemptions, you could do small business exemptions, gross receipts under a certain amount. You can also set up multiple classifications and tax different rate structures and different hybrids within each classification.
Have you seen anything dealing with, say, a venture capital-backed startup where, they're running AAA office space, but no revenue? Would you consider that a small business?
You could do number of employees under a certain amount, or under a certain square footage, or under a certain amount of gross receipts, and set that as a small business or nonprofit. It's very common to exempt nonprofits. City of Los Angeles exempts screenwriters, and they don't tax any movie-making production in the city of Los Angeles.
Shock. And frankly, this is part of, if this was the path that the council so chose to go down, these are all questions that we'll need to sit through and talk through and define. And that's part of the reason why these estimates are really not detailed analysis. They are a framework. They're supposed to start that conversation, and we would need to refine them further. At the bottom, we just have the three newest taxes that were approved. So the Mountain View business tax is estimated to generate about $6 million in annual revenues. The East Palo Alto is estimated to generate about $1.7 million in revenues. And obviously, we mentioned the newest business tax is estimated, Measure C, to be about $300 million in revenues.
Are there any actuals yet on that? Are actuals tracking with the estimates, or is it too soon to know?
Too soon to know. Mountain View hasn't even implemented theirs yet.
Yeah, okay.
All right. Additional information for consideration. So we talked about some of the considerations within each of the individual taxes. There's also the macro level picture associated with how does the community and the council want to use this tax, and what's the environment that we're in overall. So first is revenues can be leveraged to issue debt. TOT, we have been leveraging that to issue debt for our 2014 council infrastructure plan. Depending on the tax, the sensitivity of that tax can vary. And so typically, we only will leverage a portion of those revenues, because a really bad situation would be exactly fluctuations in the economy, the revenues dropping, and you have a debt payment that you must pay, otherwise you will be defaulting, and you don't have the revenue stream to back it. So that's why, again, on TOT, we did about a 70% leveraged rate based on TOT sensitivity. And just to give some context, based on that assumption of 70%, for every about $10 million in revenue, that can be leveraged for up to $98 million in debt. So if you're looking at the various revenues that we were looking at today, you can kind of do some rough ballpark math associated with how much we could leverage, depending on the choice. Timeline of the tax. Is it going to sunset? Is it going to be a forever tax? That's going to impact or potentially change how the voters perceive it. The timeframe of the election. to the implementation, as Councilmember Cormack was mentioning, do we have any actuals? To the collection of the receipts. For taxes that we already have in place, like we did with TOT, it's pretty quick. We approved the measure in November, and we started collecting the new tax rate in April. So November, December, January, February, March, April, 6 months. Mountain View recently approved the business tax in same November of 2018. They will not start collecting that tax until January 1st of 2020. There's a lot of lead time associated with it.
Can I ask a question about your assumption on debt? Are you doing that over like 15 years or 20 years?
30-year amortization period, and what we do is we look at our past debt issuances and what we were able to generate in the markets.
Is that different than bonding? So if you had 10 million a year coming in,
So people use different debt words interchangeably. So what we have done thus far is we've done COPs, certificates of participation, and we actually do lease revenue-backed bonds. So our assets are our collateral for that debt, not
Yep.
necessarily the revenue stream itself, even though we internally plan accordingly.
well, you could use the revenue stream.
You could, but you have to look at the marketability of that revenue stream to the bondholders. It's very secure if you tell the bondholders, my asset is Mitchell Park, this beautiful community center. It is different if you say it's documentary transfer tax and it goes all over the map. Bondholders are going to look at the collateral associated with the debt that we're choosing to issue.
Okay, so you get a lower interest rate if you use an asset generally?
Yes.
Okay.
But you also have to think about the magnitude of the debt that you're trying to issue. If you're trying to go out for, I don't know, what's the newest rail estimate for a crossing? 300 million? On the low end, maybe? Does the city have 300 million worth of assets that we could collateralize? And in those instances, if we don't have enough, then we would need to look at doing revenue-backed bonds. And so then it would matter the kind of revenue that we would be pledging. All complexities for us to embark on as we move forward. Enforcement and other administrative elements and costs, again, this all, you can kind of see the growing theme as we go through here. Competing ballot measures. So as a city initiative and a general election, if that was so chosen, what else is going to happen on that November 2020 ballot within the region that taxpayers and voters, frankly, will be assessing in context on any potential legislative changes that may impact taxes. And Doug has a lot more context on this, and I believe the council just got the quarterly report from sales tax that has all the legislative highlights in there associated with the current climate that we're in. So, all things to be considered.
And as far as the timeline, from certification of election results, the only stipulation is that it takes 110 days before you can make it effective. But you can set that timeline at your discretion, as long as it's greater than 110 days. There is a piece of legislation working its way through Sacramento, a state law that would lower the voter threshold for special taxes from 2/3 to 55% for infrastructure and affordable housing. That seems to have some traction this year.
Okay. What's next? After tonight, and again, just to kind of reiterate that work plan that the council approved for potential ballot measures and revenue measures, is in August or September, the staff will come back with more refined estimates and evaluation of potential tax measures. Hopefully, as we mentioned at the start, a more narrowed view of potential tax measures for the committee as well as city council to be reviewing, and also provide some guidance for initial polling. September, October, council will need to confirm the type of measure that we would be wanting to pursue so that we can start doing that stakeholder outreach at a more robust level. Conduct that initial polling that the council is going to provide some direction on, as well as further feasibility analysis. As you can see, some of these taxes could be rather complex. January through April would be staff work, working on more stakeholder outreach, drafting any legal documents that are necessary. Ultimately, if you wanted to do a November 2020 ballot measure, that would need to be approved by the city council in June. And that means everything, so you would need your ordinance, your ballot language, et cetera. So just to leave you on the final slide of the day is back to the things that we wanted to talk about. So a lot of information presented for the council, or the committee, I'm sorry. I know we'll take public comment, I think, at this point, but, you know, back to, these are the areas that we're really looking for some feedback from the committee and discussing all of these options.
Thank you.
Thank you for your patience.
So we will go to the public. I have 3 speakers. If anybody else wants to talk, please get in a card. So the first speaker is Steve Levy.
I have 2 points. You'll get the first point if you've been following the debate over who pays the tariffs for China and Mexico and whether that will affect the level of economic activity. My guess is, and this is primarily related to the business tax, that when this gets to the public discussion, people will be very interested in 2 things that are hinted at in the staff memo, but not explicit. That is, who actually pays the tax, not who is it levied on. And the staff matrix multiplication to get you started assumed there would be no leakage, there would be no diminution in economic activity. I'm not an expert. I don't have a position on that. I know when you get to the stakeholders, both of those questions will be really important. If you followed the thing with President Trump, he said Canada and Mexico paid the tax and jobs would grow. Economists on both parties unanimously said he was wrong on both points. I suggest you get some folks that do this for a living from Stanford and come and give a study session for the Finance Committee and the City Council and the general public on tax incident and on the likelihood of leakage, if any. Okay? Rather than leave that to a bunch of people screaming at each other. The second thing that the staff has now hinted at in the memo, I don't see how you can calculate the yield of a tax until you know the exemptions, which is a policy decision for the committee and the council. If you look at Mountain View, they said specifically commercial and industrial. So are we going to tax the city, the school district, churches, hospitals, nonprofits? All of a sudden that 97,000 job count gets diminished. What about size? I've suggested this to the staff several times. The California Employment Development Department has complete payroll data by size of establishment and by industry. If they would sell it to me, I would have bought it for you and given it to you. I know it exists because when I work for San Jose, they get it. You have to be a government agency. I don't think the Business Registry or the American Community Survey from the census is close to robust enough to know the structure of industry and by size so that you can determine those exemptions. And the last comment, if you're concerned about equitable, you really have to know who actually pays the tax, not who it's levied on.
Great, thank you. Our next speaker is Judy Kleinberg.
Good evening, or afternoon, or late afternoon. Just a few thoughts. In terms of types of tax, the gross receipts tax, I think from looking at the kind of economy that we have, not atypical from other communities, there are many, many businesses that have very high gross receipts and very low net revenue. And when all you're talking about is gross receipts and gross revenue, you're missing the potential very draconian impact on certain industries, especially, for example, the hospitality industry, which is hotels and restaurants. Exemptions, I think Steve just covered that. That's extremely important. A lot of what the staff has put into their report and the way they gave their oral report just now focuses on how much money can we get. I would like you to turn that around and consider the business community and what is the impact on the business community that you're going to have. Nothing here was discussed about the impact on the business community. And each one of these taxes can have a different, very harmful impact on the business community. And I think until you get that analysis, you shouldn't go forward with any of these taxes. It needs to be in tandem and a priority for your analysis. Hopefully data-driven. Obviously, this is very early in the process. But I think you need to really find out what's actually going on in our economy. Do you know how many businesses are actually teetering on the brink of going out of business? Do you really know? There are two Palo Altos. There's the Palo Alto that you see, and then there's the Palo Alto that is. And I'm talking about the business community, whether it's the Research Park or it's University Avenue or it's El Camino. There are businesses that look like they're thriving, and they're being held up by their landlords or their property managers or their property owners so that there won't be an empty storefront, so that it'll look attractive to somebody else to come in. Until you do the deep dive into what's really going on in our economy, you should be very careful and cautious about any business tax that could impact the climate and the vitality of this business community. There are different kinds of economies that are at work, the e-commerce, the online, the gig economy. Think about all the different 21st century impacts that are going on in our economy. Also, I didn't hear any discussion of a fair share approach. Since everyone is enjoying our wonderful vitality and quality of life, perhaps there might be another way to look at a fair share way of approaching these taxes. I didn't hear, was that a bell? I couldn't hear it. No? And so maybe looking at a variety or a combination of taxes where not just business but others in the community could be sharing in the infrastructure improvements and others that are on the list of improvements. Business is excited to see the improvements that are going to be made. Obviously, a thriving community is where a business wants to do business, but I think there is an approach that is also a fair share approach that I'd really like to see you talk about. In terms of the general versus the special tax, I've been in this room over and over and over again for 3 years, talking to various, now that's it?
That's it.
Okay, I'll finish the sentence. And I have said many times, also in the chambers, I did hear it,
No,
Tom.
sorry to interrupt you.
Also, that a general tax isn't transparent or accountable to anybody. You can spend it on whatever you want, you know that. Whereas a special tax, hard to pass, but at least you know where it's going, it's accountable. Business might be more interested in cooperating and collaborating if they knew where that money was going to go. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. The last speaker is Tiffany Griego.
Good evening. My name is Tiffany Griego. I'm the Managing Director of Stanford Research Park, and I am very hopeful that I can assist you with information tonight or any time so that we can facilitate a robust discussion around the value of business in Palo Alto, including small, medium, and large-scale businesses. The Research Park businesses in particular are a very significant source of revenue to the city, including revenues for affordable housing, funding for parks and recreation, as well as for the school district. But just focusing in on the general fund, the Research Park is producing $17 million a year right now for Palo Alto's general fund. That is $17 million out of a total of $80 million of tax dollars paid by Research Park businesses across all the different recipients. But focusing on the general fund, $17 million a year means that for every one employee, $600 is attributable to that employee directly to the Palo Alto general funds. By our number crunching, this is enough to pay for close to 60% of all of Palo Alto's community service line item in the budget and close to 30% of the public safety line item in Palo Alto's budget. And I just would like to highlight, I think it was you, Doug Jensen, who gave a fantastic presentation to the city, I think in possibly 2018, talking about the unique point-of-sale revenues that are generated from Stanford Research Park companies, and from, frankly, a handful of them, not from all of them. And I think it's important to focus in on those companies and really get into the mindset of what brought them here. Many of them came here as startups, and so I'm a little concerned specifically about structuring a tax that sends a strong signal to startups that this is no longer a place welcoming to startups. Startups bring disproportionately a higher level of point-of-sale probability to Palo Alto and to the research park. So I think that there's something to really dig into and unpack in terms of understanding the impact, financial positive impact that research park companies bring. I should quote the number. So $4 million a year is attributable to research park companies with respect to point of sale. Kylie mentioned Tesla, but Hewlett-Packard Enterprise was also one of those, and they recently departed the research park as well. So we would like to have a dialogue with you, and we can convene research park employers really at any time. And we have convened them, and they've asked me to pass on a few questions to you tonight. For example, what will be the structure and the cost of the tax? It's hard to form a reaction in advance of knowing the specifics. What will the funds be used for? How would a new business tax impact their willingness to fund our TMA? We are deeply invested in privately funding our Transportation Management Association and our programs, and we're concerned that without credit for those investments, a new tax on business may thwart or impact that funding. How would a tax discourage startups specifically, and what would be the impact on the point-of-sale companies in the research park? I'd also just like to end with the fact that over the past 68 years, it has really taken that long for the research park to be as financially successful as it is, and I'd like to also make sure that we have a good, strong discussion around fiscal resilience, because real estate is highly cyclical. We've faced 18% vacancies at times, and we've faced a very tight market at times, so it's really important to talk about what it means to be resilient with respect to the research park businesses in particular. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I could also.
Sure. What's his name? Kim?
Yeah, my name is Dan Kostenbetter. I'm the Vice President for Tax Policy of the Silicon Valley Leadership Group. And just like to reiterate a couple of the points. We certainly think special taxes are appropriate, particularly if you're going to add taxes besides all the general taxes that are already paid by members of the business community. The other thing I'd like to point out is that we have had, as a country, a decade of economic growth. We've been very fortunate. Silicon Valley has even had a much stronger economy in recent years. And I had a long career at the Hewlett-Packard Company before I joined the leadership group. And I saw lots of ups, but also lots of downs over that career. And when things go south and there's an economic contraction, there is really a very serious consideration of expenses, but also a question even of where are you doing business, where are you located. And some of the large companies that are headquartered here and have a significant presence are also companies that are located in many other places, and they have other options and alternatives, and they can really shift some of their activity or at least some of their growth away from Palo Alto. So I think it's a caution for all of Silicon Valley, which has been just riding this tremendous wave that we've seen over the last few years, is very strong, very robust growth. But be mindful that adding additional taxes with the thought that, oh, these companies can afford it, it's really, I think, something to be very attentive to, that we've had this great economic growth, and there will be a downturn, and a lot of companies will definitely be reevaluating a lot of their cost structures and where they're located, and this is certainly, as everyone knows, a pretty expensive, it's a pretty wonderful place to be, but it's also a pretty expensive place to be. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll come back to the committee. I would just remind us the kind of three questions we have is kind of types of tax we'd like to focus on, baseline assumptions, particularly for the rail, and I'm not so sure how far we need to go into polling and things tonight, but any ideas on that? Right. So who wants to go first?
I wonder if it might be useful to go in the order of the taxes. I just want.
I'm not sure we need to talk about all the taxes, but if you want to talk about them.
Okay, well, you guys go first then. I'll go after.
Okay.
Thank you all for speaking today, and thank you for the presentation, staff. I guess one high-level question, and I don't mean to be, flip with this, but we just went through our budget. Do we have a revenue problem?
Can you define a revenue problem? I'm not sure.
Let me take a shot at that. I think that the probably best way to contextualize a response would be we have an unmet needs or unmet priorities problem. And clearly, the one that is noted on this slide is related to rail grade separations. There was also, obviously, the council has talked about housing, specifically affordable housing is an unmet need. There are also capital priorities, but I think the first two are probably the primary impetus for this.
Okay. And I just suggest that question as a way for us to think about this, that we did have a balanced, I think, fiscally responsible budget just passed last night. And so this is all on top of that. And we're looking at other things, as the city manager mentioned, unmet needs. Some of them, I would go beyond needs. They're absolute responsibilities to our community. So just keeping that in mind. I have a whole bunch of questions, and I will try to keep them organized, but it's probably going to be hard. Just one comment on the staff report. This was really helpful, just kind of overview of the taxes. It would be really nice to have kind of just graphs about what these taxes are, how we charge them, and how they go to us versus the county, et cetera. I was just trying to make my own little bar graphs for some of them.
I finally had to do it myself.
Yeah, I was just kind of squiggling out bar graphs, so that would just be super helpful going forward. A couple other comments. As we move forward in this discussion, estimated administrative costs, that seemed kind of a unanswered thing. And then getting to my more specific questions. So you mentioned a special tax needs a specific purpose. What is a specific purpose? And you mentioned some of the taxes can be general, some can be special. Why do we choose one or the other?
Special taxes have to be spent on that specific thing that the voters approve. General tax is usually a broader community-based need, whether it's clean water, clean air, parks, public safety, all grouped together that are traditionally funded by the general fund.
Okay, and then a special tax, we would say, we want to fund our rail grade separations, and we're going to do a head count tax. And that would be a special tax, okay. Not really a question, but in terms of kind of a portability analysis, that would be helpful. I think whether our sales tax producing point of sales businesses are able to move, and are they likely to, and how do we kind of measure that sensitivity? Just a large point. I was really struck by the turnover figures for property taxes and how 50% of that revenue is coming from turnover property. But I'd also be interested in, and I guess this, if we're looking at property taxes on residential properties, what's the turnover in residential versus commercial? And just kind of what does that look like, especially because I think on the ballot next year, it seems likely that there's the split roll measure on Prop 13, so that's something we should keep in mind. I saw San Francisco, you mentioned I was doing a wage tax. When I used to live in Philadelphia, I remember we had one of those. It was like 3%, and it would go to things like police services, snow plowing, et cetera. What's the process for a wage tax? That was one I didn't see kind of in here. And what does that look like for us?
When you say a wage tax, do you mean a payroll tax?
Payroll tax, yeah.
What do you mean, what's the process?
So I just didn't really see it covered in any of these slides.
So it would be under the business tax slide for San Francisco. San Francisco has a payroll tax that they actually changed in the more recent past to be more on gross receipts, frankly. How do we leverage that? Is that the question?
I guess that kind of answers it. I just think it's most likely we're going to go with the business tax page. I think that's probably where we have the most questions and interest. So it'd be nice to kind of break some of these up, whether it's gross receipts, payroll, square footage, head count, et cetera.
Is it true that only charter cities can do payroll taxes?
I believe so.
That's good to know. Okay. So
And those are all details that we will need to be getting into in the next
Sure.
round.
Okay. A few more just diving in. On the business tax page, if we're looking at a square footage tax, would it be possible to sort that by office space class? So A, B, C, et cetera?
I suppose you could absolutely put a regulation like that in, but we would need to look at how you would
Do that.
do that,
Okay.
frankly. You know, I hesitate to say, no, you can't do that. But all of this would go back to that kind of feasibility of.
Yep.
So if those are kind of the areas that the committee wants the staff to do more research on and figure out, absolutely, we can focus our time in those
Okay.
areas.
And then East Palo Alto exempted buildings under 25,000 square feet. Was that roughly just to kind of target the newer, bigger developments that have come online recently? I know it's broad.
I don't, I couldn't comment on why they chose that.
Okay.
I can make assumptions, but.
That was my assumption. On that note, just kind of getting at how you're answering this, it would be nice to know where we actually have the most data in terms of administrability of these taxes. And my sense is just it may be on kind of the square footage and building footprints, things like that. That's my sense, but I'm not really sure. I'm also interested in what Mr. Levy said about I forget what he mentioned, the state's EDD data. That seems like a good avenue for us to go looking at. In terms of a few other provisions, sunsetting as we go forward and looking at this, what other cities have done, do any of these sunset? I know we probably don't know that tonight. Or are they just for all of time? I think that's an important consideration. As we look at these exemptions, I don't know if any of us, I mean, I'm sure we all have ideas about what may be exempted or no exemptions, et cetera. I'm just thinking it may be a nice exercise for us to have kind of a full yield case and an exemption yield case. Right now, we're looking at full yield, we're assuming no exemptions. But whatever we move forward with, I would like, I guess, to see two parallel analyses there. So one is, if we just do the full tax and there's no exemptions, what does that look like? And if we were to do the set of exemptions that this committee and council proposes, what does that look like? I asked about estimated administrative costs. Fair share was brought up by former Mayor Kleinberg. I think, the community and council momentum is, really on page 11 here on the business tax items. I think we need to be careful around hotels. We've really pushed that. But I am potentially interested in a parcel tax on affordable housing. And I know some communities, it seems, we passed, measure, I think it was a few years ago here in Palo Alto. There was a large $6 billion statewide bond on affordable housing this past year. And there may be some appetite there if we're talking about some kind of fair share proposal. And then kind of the last question is, what do we want to spend this money on? I think obviously we can all say housing and transportation. I don't think that's specific enough. And I guess the question is, at what point does this committee or council decide on how that money is spent, if at all? Is there a drop-dead deadline for that?
On how to spend it?
Yeah.
If the council chooses to go down a special tax route, yes. Because the special tax on the ballot, they would have to designate exactly what they wanted it to be spent.
Okay. So I would just suggest to my colleagues, that's another thing to keep in mind. If we go forward with any of these, what is the money for? When do we have to decide and who decides? I just remember when I was working at MTC, the Regional Transportation Authority, and we went with a vehicle license fee. Every single penny of every single dollar was accounted for before it went out. And everybody knew where those funding streams were going to go, which programs were funded and which weren't. I don't know if we want to or need to be that specific, but it's something to keep in mind. Those are my general questions. We'll probably have some more, but I'll give up the mic for a moment.
Do you want to go?
There's a lot of information here, so I think sometimes it's helpful to know what not to focus on. I know everyone didn't want to go through it, but I'm not interested in raising the hotel tax again. I think the documentary transfer tax has a lot of, I'm not interested in that one from this perspective at this large level. If I think about the utility users tax, we did just agree to raise rates. I don't think that's the first place that I would look. So those are three that unless, there's information that hasn't been presented, I'm not interested in pursuing at this time for this magnitude of the money that we're looking at. So that leaves property sales and business tax, so I'll just take those in order. You had a parcel tax, but not a bond. Can you talk through why you suggested a parcel tax as opposed to a bond?
A bond would have to be for a specific purpose, and so since we hadn't necessarily identified what the money was going to be spent on, but absolutely we could do a bond measure if that was the council's direction.
Okay, and if I went through your numbers correctly, it'd be, if we did $100 parcel tax at 20,000 parcels, that's about $2 million in a year? I was just trying to extend it. You had the parcel tax in there, but it wasn't extended all the way out.
Right.
Perhaps Mr. Guagliardo's looking at us. Yeah.
What?
Is he?
Oh, Steve's here. No, give us a second to do that math.
I would just say that, the advantages to the parcel tax is everyone pays the same. So I'm a big fan of matching sources and uses of funds, and who pays has certainly been addressed. So if everyone in the community is going to use whatever it is we're paying for in the same way, then maybe the parcel tax makes more sense. But if there's a reason to have a progressive tax, then I think a bond also makes sense, right? So I just don't want us to not consider that just because it wasn't in here. Sales tax, I think it's worth having in the mix, at least in the beginning, to consider a range of options. I don't like to cross things off earlier. 0.25% doesn't seem like a lot. I appreciate the part of the report that indicated that it's the most regressive, so obviously I don't love that part. On the other hand, it is something that people understand intuitively, voters, and to the extent that we match it to what we spend it on, again, if somebody has a great argument, I'm not prepared to take it off the list. Okay, so that brings us to business taxes. I appreciate the comments from Judy Kleinberg, former mayor of Chamber of Commerce, about, gross receipts can perhaps not be appropriate, not only for the certain kinds of business she suggested, but also for the scenario you were suggesting earlier, Chair Du Bois, like, they could have no receipts and yet you'd be occupying space. So I'm less interested in that. If it's not too much work, sometimes it's nice to do that because it helps people understand the three options. And if we cross something off early, then people won't see the full range. I'm not asking you to do extra work. I'm saying it's probably not the best option, but if it's easy, to do a little sketch, that might be worth having in our, consideration set. Employees versus office space. I don't think we know enough yet. So the lists of information that I would need to have before we make any of these decisions are the number of employees and the distribution, right? How many, well, we'll just say businesses as a general, phrase for the moment, have under 10 employees. We'll pick the number. I'm sure that there's someone who has better information, 11 to 25, whatever. So the distribution of that, and then some examples from each. I do worry about unintended consequences with things like this. So to the extent we can see, where is the dentist's office? Where is the restaurant that everyone understands the name? Some way to sort of get a picture of like, what are the 5 tranches? And the same would go for the size of offices, right? So 25,000 square feet, it's pretty big. I don't know. I don't know how many of our businesses are below that. And then the distribution, again, an example. So those sort of 3 things around a business tax that would be assessed against number of employees versus office space. Very interesting to think about contractors, telecommuting, that is really tricky. So hopefully, we're not the first jurisdiction to consider this, so hopefully we can understand what, things they've run into and things they thought about with that. So that, I think, addresses A. We haven't really talked about B, but I just picked the biggest one on here, which is the 31 million, if you do the East Palo Alto version on all office space, and then you multiply by the 9.8, we get in the vicinity of something that might be 1 grade separation. I don't know, that's the biggest number on here, and it's gonna take that to get to 1, if I'm doing my math correctly. So I doubt that we should transmit to the, ourselves, our portion of the rail committee. Are you asking, we can't give you direction to give to the NCAP extended, whatever we're calling them for tomorrow, right? No.
I think we'll just
They're probably all
convey
watching.
the nature of the conversation. Yes, exactly. For any of them who aren't watching, convey the nature of the conversation.
Okay, so, I mean, from my perspective, it's a little hard to see. Again, I guess that assumes that the 2.5 per square foot is the appropriate number, right? Again, in the interest of seeing a range, it'd probably be helpful to see at $1, and I mean, it'd be pretty straightforward and perhaps even a higher number, just in case we were trying to see what that would look like. Refinement of estimates, and let me just see if I had anything else in this. Oh, yeah, just back to other uses that Vice Mayor Fine talked about. Grade separation, certainly one. Affordable housing, certainly one. There are other massive community things. So to the extent we matched it with, if say grade separation went loosely with a business tax, perhaps property or sales tax might go loosely with, a more community-based one. I think that's an interesting avenue to think about. And again, community things would include Cubberley and the Parks Master Plan, et cetera, et cetera. Not recommending we do this. I know that that's happened sometimes, not saying, we should go out and do these for the community part, but it's worth thinking about. Okay, I'll stop there and see what Chair.
Okay, a lot to think about. Yeah, so personally, I think we need to focus on a business tax. Again, we're one of the few cities that doesn't have one, and I think that's what council was interested in. In terms of like sales tax, we are limited. We only have a 1/4 cent left by state law, and I think that we could possibly be competing against other sales tax measures. And I do think it's regressive, so I'd prefer we just stay focused on a business tax discussion. I think for me, kind of looking forward and kind of looking at what's happening in Silicon Valley, the issue is really a lack of general funds to keep up with growth. And I see it as across the board services, affordable housing, homeless services, police, fire, transit, and parking, just projects to make the city livable in general. And, we're one of the wealthiest areas in the world, and I think income equality has been growing. We have a lot of bonds that pile up, and we've had a lot of regressive taxes. So we've had sales taxes, gas taxes, bridge taxes. And so I would be interested in a more progressive kind of tax. I have been talking to council members in other cities. I've heard that Mountain View has some regret that they started at a lower level of tax. And I know that Cupertino, Redwood City, San Jose are looking at significant business taxes. And so I think one of the questions for council is really kind of what level of taxation are we talking about? In terms of business taxes, I think we've gone over the different types. And I do think thinking about unintended consequences and how they'd be applied is critical. I do think like Mountain View is a good example in terms of messaging and thinking about polling. And I would suggest we kind of look at their materials as a starting place. And I do think there's a potential for a citizens initiative if we don't get this right, and we should keep that in mind as well. I think when we think about the different kinds of business taxes, headcount, gross receipts, payroll, it's useful to try to convert it into similar units, like, dollars per employee per year, if you can make some assumptions so that you can kind of compare the different forms. I think right now with San Francisco's 3 taxes, they're at about $1,500 a worker a year. They do vary it by type of business. And that's about 20 times the average business tax on the peninsula. So I think a lot of peninsula cities, we've been kind of small towns. I think we're a little behind the 8 ball. East Palo Alto, took a big leap. They're at about $500 a worker if you kind of convert square footage to space per employee. So I do think as we kind of take this to council, we should be including San Francisco and potentially things that San Jose is considering as comparison points. If you get outside the Bay Area, I think New York has like a 4.5% payroll tax, which is about $4,500 a year for somebody making $100,000 a year. DC's at 6%, Pittsburgh's at 3%. And so I do think we need to be thinking of ourselves in terms of those kinds of numbers based on the industry we have here. I do like the ease framework in the staff report. I'd love to see that kind of applied to options, if that's the intent. I also think it might be interesting to add bondability as another thing on the framework. I think you said some taxes might lend themselves to that more than others. I personally, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, talking to other cities, kind of looking at what they've done. I think there's a lot of positives with a square foot tax. It becomes part of a lease. It could be it would scale, so it could be relatively small for a small office. And it's a tax on the space, not necessarily on employees. And so I think it would become part of renegotiating your lease or looking for office space. And if it was kind of at the 3% level, I don't think it would really change a lot of decisions in terms of renting office space. And I also like that it would potentially adjust to the economy. So in a down economy, if it was a percentage of rent, it could go up and down. I also think we would need relatively few exemptions. Again, a small business would naturally just pay little because they have a small space. I think we might want to focus on commercial industrial business types. I think San Francisco excludes medical. Those are considerations. In terms of uses, again, I really believe it should be a general tax. I think we should indicate kind of intention of where we would use the funds. And I could see it being similar to like Measure B in San Mateo County, where we could say, 60 to 70% of this is going to go towards transportation, which could be grade SEPs and the TMA. Say 15 to 25% could be affordable housing. And then there should be, I think, some portion that goes in the general fund. And, to me, part of this is saying that we're all in this together and having businesses contribute to the community generally. It used to be, I think, much more the case, when you think about kind of historically things like IBM towns, where cities benefited from the businesses in their towns. And so I'm not necessarily interested in a specific tax where kind of businesses pay specifically for something that they use. But I think again, there should be a small general fund contribution. So in terms of like moving forward, I really think we should send to council kind of a range from maybe somewhere like the Mountain View level of taxation to the San Francisco level of taxation in a business tax. And again, kind of applying a framework in terms of ease of administration and collection. Again, the reason I kind of like a square foot tax is it seems very easy to administer. The other thing in terms of types of tax, I do think, again, there's potentially the Prop 13 split roll tax. Caltrain, there may be a quarter cent sales tax, might be an MTC regional sales tax. So I think we want to avoid those. And then the other thing I guess we could talk about is some kind of phase-in period, right? So if we did go with a square footage tax or payroll tax, does it start at a lower level and maybe increase over a couple of years? Yeah, so I think that's most of my comments. I do think it's important that we kind of try to narrow the scope as much as possible. We think we have a lot of time, but I can see the calendar ticking by quickly, and if we keep it too wide, I think we risk running out of time. Yep.
Nice to hear both your comments. Just a few notes I've just written down, just want to surface quickly. So one thing, I'll just say I kind of do agree with Councilmember Cormack about the documented transfer, the TOT, and the utility transfer. I think those are probably not my favorite option, and agree with Councilmember Du Bois that narrowing it down is helpful. One of my questions is, it would be nice to see a menu of what other taxes we think will be on the ballot for Palo Alto voters, and the ones Councilmember Du Bois mentioned on sales tax have been on my radar too, so that may knock that one out. I like Councilmember Cormack's suggestion of if we are going to pair two or more of these, there may be a nice alignment in terms of a business tax to fund some of those services, and maybe a property tax or otherwise to serve some of the community serving functions that we would love to meet. In terms of the business tax and what it could serve, I think it would be important both functionally and politically to think about how those taxes support business, whether it is improved mobility or maybe it's business development services at City Hall to help our local retail businesses and other commercial enterprises that want to locate here in Palo Alto. One thing I've mentioned on this a few times is I think one risk we do run as a council with a business tax is I get the sense whatever we put on the ballot will pass. And I think on the one hand, that means there's no function for us to really sharpen our pencils on it, and we could be sloppy and it will still pass, and that worries me because there are lots of negative downsides. I think it also means we may not do our full duty in engaging the business community. And I'll note, the folks who spoke tonight were mostly speaking on behalf of the business community in this city, and that's important. And so I think we should strongly consider a special tax. I think on the one hand, it will force us to be more judicious in our decision-making, and ideally, I think it might even include the business community and garner some of their support. I'm also interested in a sunset. I think, especially if we're talking about taxes up to, as Councilmember Du Bois suggested, of the San Francisco magnitude, $300 million, greater than our general fund annually.
I meant per worker, not total.
Okay. Good.
They're a lot bigger than us,
Yeah,
so
okay.
you have a
Good,
really
good,
good rate
okay,
if you
okay,
wanted
okay.
that
Sorry,
much.
I misunderstood that. But even then, going from, roughly the zero that we're at today to 1,500 an employee, that's a huge impact. And I think we need to consider that carefully in a sunset provision, especially if we're looking at some things which, are these one-time things, whether it's the, Coverly plan or grade separation. Those are obviously large expenses, but they're not ongoing expenses. Some folks mentioned potentially a credit for participating in the TMA. I don't think that's a bad idea. I think those things are complementary, and we may want to look at that. We haven't talked much about exceptions or hardships. I do like Councilmember Du Bois' suggestion that a square foot tax is potentially naturally less onerous on small businesses, but I'd like to dig into that a bit more. And in terms of other exemptions, I think we just need a bit more data on what are the type of business activities going on here, and how we might be touching them. In terms of hardships, one of the speakers mentioned, we've been on this great economic wave for almost 10 years now, but there's potentially a recession looming, and what would our hardship look like? Maybe it says if there's 2 quarters of, negative economic activity, the tax goes on a freeze. And I'd love to understand, is that possible? And what are the most effective kind of salves for the business community if we implement these taxes over the long run? And then just kind of citing some of my preferences. It's early, but I think I'm also aligned with Councilmember Du Bois on potentially a square footage tax. And I think the reasons why, as I think about it, one, we know we have one of the most expensive office markets in the world, and I think on a square footage basis, and I think that maybe speaks to an ability or even a desire to tax that basis. Two, I think in terms of administrability, as I mentioned earlier, it may be the one we have the most data on, although it's probably quite hard to determine who is in a specific office building, office, commercial, whatever. So that's of interest to me. I will say it doesn't necessarily address other problems. So one thing, we haven't heard it recently at council, but occasionally we do have folks saying, hey, it's the number of employees per office building and they're packed in like sardines in these startups. A square footage tax doesn't necessarily address that. A headcount tax may, but that also may be negative, right? If companies have all offices in multiple cities and they say, hey, forget Palo Alto, I'm going to shift them to Sunnyvale. That may not be a good thing for our knock-on economic effects. I remember a few years ago, I think Palantir produced that report saying our employees in the downtown contribute something like $12 million to, restaurants, laundromats, pharmacy, et cetera. And so we should keep that in mind too. I think Councilmember Du Bois is also right that a square footage tax may scale well with, the economy going up and down. But I would love to see how we can break it apart, whether it's by office class type or potentially different users. I guess the question there, if we do this real estate square footage tax, could we, for instance, say office commercial R&D, but not hotels?
Sure. To be honest, if we were to go down a path like this, we would be writing a new tax. And so from an ordinance perspective, we can specify we need to, frankly, specify the definitions of things as well as who, frankly, it would be assessed on. And that's where, kind of going back to that ease concept, is how far down that rabbit hole do you go as a council in terms of laying out those.
Sure. So then just finishing up, in terms of the ones where I think we've each laid out a couple of, what's the word? Criteria we'd like to look at for, I think, any of these taxes, whether it's ease, whether it's exemptions, whether it's hardships, a few others the folks have mentioned. But I think the ones I'm most interested in looking at are potentially a parcel tax, and then on the business tax page, I think it's probably all of these at the current time. Although I guess, we've already heard some early issues raised on the gross receipts and payroll side, but just some more thoughts.
I'm just going right off what you just said about parcel tax. The school districts are sunset, so that's built into the parcel tax. And Palo Alto residents or people who are associated with PAUSD, because it's not exactly the same, do pay a pretty hefty parcel tax. So I'm happy to leave that on the table, again, in the context of matching it to, sources and uses of funds. I'm the only one who thinks it's too early to get rid of sales, so I'm the only one, so we can get rid of the sales tax. I didn't hear other, no, you're not.
I think Councilmember Du Bois raised some good points that there are potentially other ones that are competing and we're limited by the state. I don't think we need to dash it yet, but.
We're rebuilding the entire city. It's hard for me to imagine another time when we're going to need, more money. And then on the general and specific, so arguments in favor of the specific, frankly, to me, are transparency. It's, having run a bond where we asked people exactly, you're going to pay this much and here's what you're going to get. It makes it a lot easier. And I know there have been some concerns expressed in the past about ballot language. If you think about the state's experience with SB 1, right? There were a lot of concern about how transportation tax was spent, and then they came back and did it as a specific tax. So I think there are arguments to do that from a good government standpoint. Frankly, that's all going to come down to the polling, I think. So we can talk about what we're interested in, but I think we will learn more when we get to the polling, and that will help inform us as to what the electorate is most interested in doing. I don't know that it's necessary to have that discussion finalized at this point. Last year, everyone was talking about a head tax. This year, everyone's talking about square footage. I think more research on both is absolutely appropriate. I'll just say that. Who knows what next year's topic will be. And what else did I have on this one? Oh, exemptions. I definitely spoke about this last year when we were just, when this was a topic. I think some sort of floor, whether it's number of employees or number of square feet, or, it doesn't sound like we're talking too much about revenue, I think is going to be appropriate. And I don't know what that is yet, right? So love your idea of seeing, the full version and the version with some exemption. And I certainly trust staff to say, like, is it 5 employees or 7 or 10? I don't know what the answer is, but picking something that's relatively low just to help us understand what that looks like. And, yeah. Is this enough information for you on your 3 questions?
So a couple of comments. So I agree on some kind of floor. And again, I'm envisioning possibly tiers as you go from small to large. I think that's the way Mountain View works in San Francisco. So a question on our history of tax measures, I guess. I mean, when's the last time we did a general measure, the TOT? And we did that with an advisory, right, of how we were going to spend that money. It was part of the ballot measure.
No.
So how do we, I guess.
TOT was a general tax. We didn't do a complementary advisory measure.
Okay, but I thought there was a lot in the ballot language that's going to be used for infrastructure projects, and we listed those projects.
I think it was to advance city needs such as, and wording along those lines. I don't believe it was specific to the level that one might describe an advisory.
And so what is an advisory, I guess, just versus a specific tax?
You mean to a complementary advisory measure instead of to a general tax as opposed to a special tax?
Right.
I think that's something, unless you're familiar with it, Molly would need to do some research and help us
So I really think it's important
define.
that council understands that range of options, and again, even, sure.
Thanks, Andy.
All right, I'm not exactly sure what you're referring to as an advisory measure. I have seen them where they're kind of non-binding policies that are put on the ballot in San Francisco as propositions, but they're non-binding. So how Mountain View structured their tax, it was a general tax, but they did indicate in the ballot question that they intended that the resources would be spent on these types of activities, like transportation, grade separations, and all that, but also very clearly stated that the revenue was being collected for general revenue purposes.
Yeah, that's all I meant. And again, I think that's what we did with our TOT, right? And has the city ever done a specific measure?
Yes, the library bond.
Okay, that typically has a bond, right? And do we know if we did anything before that, or?
No, but we had a bond fail. So we had a specific tax fail in about 2002, and same year that the school district had a parcel tax fail.
In the 2008 or 2009, the business tax failed, right?
Beg your pardon? The library.
That was general. In 2008 or 2009, the previous quote-unquote business tax failed, but I think that was general.
It wasn't
I'm saying-
2008.
2009?
It wasn't 2008, that's all, I'm pretty sure.
It might have been 2010,
Okay.
2010.
I don't know, maybe I only focused on the library.
So look, yeah.
Oh, actually, wait, I'm sorry, can I just slip in one other thing I forgot? When you were talking about transit, I know you left off shuttle buses. I know you were thinking shuttle buses. When you listed all those other options, I'm just going to slip that one in there.
Okay. So again, I want to say that I think we need an ongoing source of revenue, and I think the threshold for special tax is high, so I think we should definitely go for general tax, but I think you're right. I think polling will give us direction there. I also want to kind of point out, again, if we think of a tiered tax, the Trump tax cut really was a windfall to large companies. Going forward, I don't know if we need to make a motion or how you want to handle, if you want to take this as kind of more of a study session. But personally, what I would like to see is really analysis of a headcount tax and a square footage tax in particular. And if we add a couple of other types, but I think it'd be really useful to have somewhat fleshed out scenarios for council to react to, and potentially with a kind of a range of conditions in these scenarios that we could kind of mix and match and compare and contrast. So again, I think the more we can kind of have some specific, scenarios, it'll be easier to get reaction and have a discussion.
I'll just add that a table would be helpful. So the narrative was great, but, once we get there, and I know other council members will ask for a table if it's not provided. And appropriately so, because it's hard to pull out all the information.
So again, do you need a specific motion, or do you think you have enough here to bring something to council?
Well, actually, so to that point, with the council, I think the question for the committee would be what framing would be most helpful to take it to the council, whether it is to focus on specific areas and they can respond and provide some reaction as to whether they think that's the right focus or if they want to broaden it. At the same time, recognizing this is your first discussion, substantive discussion of this topic, I don't know that it's reasonable to expect you to get too far with that. The one other dimension is listed or was listed under B is tomorrow night we'll have the expanded Citizens Advisory Panel discussion. I do expect their reaction will be one of hoping there had been some clarity as to the order of magnitude. But again, recognizing this is your first discussion, I don't know that that's a reasonable expectation.
So just to clarify what I was saying about a range of like Mountain View to San Francisco, again, I was talking about converting that to kind of a revenue per employee, if you will, or per worker. And, again, like you said, it's very early on, so but maybe at the rail committee, you could really, again, kind of talk about that range.
And to ensure I got my notes correct, this is San Francisco on the order of $1,500 per employee, and New York?
No, not
New
that
York
York
high.
was like 4,500.
Okay, that's on the high end, right? So,
Mountain View.
And Mountain View, I'm sorry, I didn't get that on a converted per employee.
Actually, it's like 150.
At max, Mountain View is 150, so it would just depend on that tiered system.
Okay, so somewhere on the 150 to 1,500 per employee.
This may be a bit simplistic, but I'm already imagining in my head kind of a table where the rows are the different types of taxes, right? And the columns are the E's, things, the potential tiering, the revenue per employee, et cetera. And some of these other, I'm missing the word tonight, criteria we've all raised for different taxes. And there's probably another set of tables in terms of what the exemptions or tiering looks like, hardships, et cetera.
So I think the assumptions changed based on the type of tax.
Yes.
Right?
I have a question. And I have a question for the committee. Following up on one of the public speakers had talked about recommending something like a leakage study. And I heard one member of the committee talk about wanting to have some more information about potential impact on the business community. And And I think there's a big difference between that being a small subset of a larger bunch of data we do in research on taxing versus something more like an environmental scan of the community and the current state. And it would be helpful to get a better sense from the committee, given the interest expressed by the council last night on economic development and economic vitality, if the committee has an interest in studying where the community is, as opposed to us sort of going on our gut instincts or our sense based on our experience of property values, whether or not that's accurately reflecting the current state in the business community, which is not as readily visible sometimes to the naked eye.
I guess the question, I think we certainly want that data. I think the question is, are we too wide right now to do that? Like, should we do that once we narrow in so that we're limiting the types of analysis we want to do? Because I think, again, a certain type of tax may scale in a certain way. You may be able to calculate it as a % overhead, and then we could go out to maybe different business types to say, you know, it's just going to be a hardship. Like, again, a impact on a restaurant may be very different from a high-tech company.
Right. Right. A preliminary kind of research we could do is more of an environmental scan on the current state of the economy of the city in the context of the larger region and the larger economy. You know, many cities start with an economic development strategy. You know, where are we on our continuum of wanting to do a lot of incentivizing to attract businesses, wanting to sort of stay neutral and let the market play out, or feeling comfortable about being able to exploit being an incredibly successful community. And somewhere in, you know, where are we on the continuum? I'm not sure we have a clear sense of that as a city right now.
So I'll just jump in and say thank you very much for the suggestion. I would absolutely welcome that and think it would be the right thing to do on a couple of levels. One, I think you're right. We don't know exactly where we are on the continuum of economic development or, you know, lack thereof. I think, two, it is the just thing to do for our business community, actually. And I speak to a lot of our local retailers and businesses, and I think they are hurting more than we may realize. And then also just kind of on the timeline, if we are approaching a recession, what does that look like? And, you know, how is our community prepared for it? And then I do agree with Councilmember Du Bois, as we get more specific, ideally we can test some of these tax cases against that data.
I would support doing that in parallel, and you know, with this work, I think the other thing to think about is it's possible you have a heterogeneous environment, right? So we may have certain kinds of companies doing extremely well and certain kinds of companies or uses doing poorly at the same time. So that, I think, is the part that I would be most interested in. Again, looking forward to unintended consequences, right?
So at the risk of pushing here, I do think.
And getting more clear, that would be,
Thank you, that's a good
sort
thing.
of high level.
That's great.
I don't have my Michelle translator yet.
So let me suggest this. I think we'll need a committee translator, which would be a motion. I think it would be helpful to advance to the council a motion that indicates where the committee is suggesting staff focus.
Okay.
Could we do this, maybe, could you pull up the suggestion? Could maybe do this
Can we, yeah.
item at a time, you think? So potential tax measures that we should prioritize and focus on. So,
And can I suggest A and C can kind of be collapsed, right? If you provided direction to proceed with refinement of estimates and evaluation of, instead of potential tax measures, take A and try and prioritize and focus within that. And then any other additional motions the council would, or the committee would like to.
take a stab if you want. Go ahead.
So I think Chair Du Bois suggested we take these one by one. I agree with you, Kylie. We can kind of fold A into C. On the potential tax measures, I think the ones we're most interested in are all of the business tax options proposed here. And I think you've heard how we kind of prioritize those a little bit. and then also potentially a parcel tax. I think that's kind of where we were. Sales tax was on the bubble.
Gross receipts, are you sure we want that in there?
I think I'd like to see a bit more. I hear some hesitation from us and folks on it, but did you think we should not include it?
Just trying to, cross things off that I think are unlikely to make it across the final, one of those sports metaphors.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's the one. Finish line, that's the one I was looking for.
Are we including
Goal line.
payroll tax, which was not in the presentation?
I was kind of thinking on this page. I hear you on that, Allison. I mean, I think, what do you think?
So what?
He's saying
I should have been
headcount,
specific.
gross-
Yes.
Yeah, so,
Headcount tax, square footage, and then the two others we're thinking about are gross receipts and payroll.
I'm okay keeping it more focused.
So not gross receipts?
Yeah.
What about payroll?
I guess, can you give us some sense of the differentiation between payroll versus number of employees? Are those essentially similar? Is there a wide variety when people implement those?
Usually payroll is on some type of tax mechanism on the total payroll, not broken down by individual head count.
But
So
is the effect essentially in the same ballpark, or?
No, I think different industries are going to have different pay levels. So you might have a head count tax on an industry that has very
Oh, I
high
see.
incomes or very high payrolls.
So the headcount tax would be more regressive?
Yes.
And the payroll tax would be more progressive? Okay, more interested now in leaving the payroll tax in then.
And then what were the other ones?
So I guess we have three: headcount, square footage, and payroll, and parcel. I think was the other one Councilmember Cormack and I were interested in. Does that
Yep.
satisfy folks?
Yes.
Okay. And
Second.
then the second part of this was refinement of estimates and evaluation, including blah, blah, blah.
No, it's B. We did A and C,
Yeah,
basically.
I'm just thinking if there's anything we need to do on C, but I think that's more in our comments, the different criteria we want to look at. Councilmember Du Bois has suggested that per employee, a few of us have brought up a couple others. On B, potential baseline assumptions of annual revenue or bond finance proceeds should be transmitted to the Council Mail Committee.
So yes, again, I would argue at this point that we should look at a range.
Yeah. I'm there too, and I think it's a couple of ranges. One is what you mentioned in terms of like bond sensitivity, right, which is these lend themselves to bonds. Two is the range of revenue per employee. Another interesting one, Councilmember Cormack mentioned, one grade separation costs roughly $300 million. It may be interesting to kind of align these taxes to some of the unmet needs, right? And say, gosh, if we wanted to fund all of grade separations, it looks like this. If we wanted to do the parks plan, it looks like this. Is anybody interested in that, or is that
I actually
not
think
good?
it should be a separate item. Like,
Okay.
there should be something about use of funds, right? I think that should be a discussion point at council.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's really kind of this discussion about general, specific, and then uses.
Sure.
But you mean separate item, or we should have them on the same evening?
I mean, like a D, like
Yeah,
a point
okay,
D.
yeah, right. But I think the methodology you're suggesting is very helpful, 1.5 grade separations, half of
Yeah.
a Cubberley, 2/3 of a Parks plan, yeah.
Yeah, 100% of the shuttle.
Four Wilton Courts, yeah. Partridge in a pear tree.
So if I could summarize, so the motion would be that we would focus in on the headcount, square footage, payroll, and parcel tax. that we would look at a range of assumptions, including a range of revenue for employee, bondability.
And the ease and all that other stuff.
Yeah, and the other kind of framework. And that we would also include a discussion on potential uses of the tax and the type, whether general or specific tax. And then parallel, we will do a survey of the business environment, I guess. Does that capture it?
I think so. Did you have the floor, the exemption concept in there as one of the in the scenarios, the ranges, or staff?
I think staff's
Okay.
heard the committee on the kind of various thoughts of the
Tiering or whatever.
yeah, of what to be considered. Yep. So narrowing it to the headcount, square footage, and payroll, I think is sufficient.
Okay, so all in favor? Aye.
Can I ask one clarifying question on the parcel tax? Is the committee's intention that we look at a parcel tax similar to like a GO bond? Or a parcel tax similar to EPA's square footage?
I think we called out square footage separately. So on
Yeah, I
that-
would say the former.
The bond?
Yeah.
Just making sure I understand.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, everybody. So I guess the last item is just future meetings and agendas.
Actually, is this motion forwarding this to council? I'm sorry.
Sorry, say it again.
Is this forwarding this information to council or?
I guess it's directing staff to develop a report based on this feedback to bring to council, right?
And so the question is,
Does it come back here first or go there?
does it come back to council, or sorry, to the committee with the follow-up work here, or do you want to vet this direction with the full council as well? And
When do you think this might be ready?
We won't be able to have more detailed analysis until late August.
well, so the question would be, if we went to council, let's say in mid-August,
Correct.
would, and potentially if it's simply to transmit the motion, to get the council's feedback on this trajectory, for lack of a better term, that would be while the analysis itself is ongoing. There could be some benefit to that if you'd like to get feedback from, or discussion with the full council on how this is shaping up. But that said, I think I would expect this to come back to the committee for further discussion in either case.
Yeah, I don't know, I kind of favor sending this direction to council, just getting some feedback.
I think I'd prefer to see a bit of the product first, because I think if we do send this to council, my worry a little bit is they're going to say like, oh, drop, the payroll tax and bring up the gross receipts, right? That's that kind of
The other
thinking.
worry is we do all the work and then they say the same thing.
I'm with the vice mayor on this. I'd like to see it come back and have us take another stab at it so we can refine it and do a little bit more of the work. It's possible some of this will be able to come off, right? We won't have to take 4 forward.
Yeah, I just think we should be sensitive to
No, but
doing
like,
too much and then having it rejected by the
Yeah.
council.
Yeah, but I think at the same time, this is a big discussion, and, we're all talking to community members and our colleagues about this. And,
it
yeah.
a little bit depends on, if you think if it'll be refined enough, to go to council, or if you think it would benefit from more workshopping, essentially. And I don't know that because you haven't done it yet, and you probably don't know that either.
And also the timeline to turn it around. If it
Yeah.
came to us first, how quickly would it get to council?
We do, let's see, on one of the slides. We had
August.
wanted to get to initial polling in September. And so, thinking through the council's discussion that will be necessary in order to provide the clarity for that at that point in time. And again, recognizing this is also, as Vice Mayor pointed out, trying to get enough clarity for the community discussion, both stakeholders, potential payers, as well as others who are tracking the needs.
I guess if I think about the parallel with like rail, with like all the alternatives and then narrowing, that argues for going to council sooner rather than later to share like the whole.
Here's what we're working on.
The whole, yeah, picture.
I mean, if we could turn it around in a week or two, then it's not a big difference, right? If it doesn't get to council until September, I'm starting to worry about it.
That's a problem, yeah. So, and
Well,
again,
those dates were all predicated on October being the final decision for grade separation, right? That's what those dates are predicated on?
to a certain extent, I think, as was discussed this evening, I think as much on the critical path is the stakeholder discussion and how to have enough of a, lack of a better term, straw man, for there to be substantive discussion of both impacts as well as benefits and to allow that to get more specific in preparation for a 2020 ballot measure.
So where are you guys?
I think if we return to this committee with a report similar to this, but kind of a little more focused on the options we've brought up today, I don't think we're going to, at this committee, change the direction markedly, and that would be helpful to send on to council just with our comments at that point. That's my thought. I don't think we actually risk what you mentioned, Chair Du Bois, about council radically altering this. That's just my feeling.
The area where I get concerned, though, is about the details, right? What is the floor for the exemption? What is the level of the tiers? We could, I mean, that will be important information, and that'll be hard to do with
That's going to take a
7
couple of
people.
iterations.
But
Yeah.
I also think if we get this next report back to finance, it'll at least give us that range, right? Like, hey, here's the range of exemptions you could do, or the types of hardship you can do, and then we pass that on to council. Seems helpful to me.
So our next meeting is on the 20th? So, yeah. There is a council meeting August 5th.
So technically, you actually could have a committee meeting on the 6th. I just
Yeah.
don't know how much additional information. Frankly, I'll be honest, I won't have additional information to the level that the committee has discussed this evening by that date, especially if we wanted to pack it out 2 weeks in advance of that. Yeah.
And a few options we were just talking about. Yes, there is a council meeting on the 5th of August. We're already, I think, packing that agenda as we were looking at the agendas going forward. The 12th, one option Kylie just suggested, just for your consideration, might be to provide this motion as a status report consent item to the full council. And if there is desire for discussion, that could be discussed on the 12th or thereabouts, while the work proceeds.
Well, a consent item, though, I think we would need more than consent.
Right, it would not give you feedback from the full council, it would simply be a status report more than anything else.
And assuming that they didn't ask for more discussion, tacit, keep going.
I think they'll ask.
I know. I think so too.
I think one way to think about tonight's conversation is that it was helping staff scope the research to bring back. And so perhaps once a more substantive work product is prepared by staff with some consulting expertise, then you'd be able to ask the kinds of questions you wanted to ask tonight that were premature because this was the preliminary. Here's a loose sense of numbers to give you a sense of order of magnitude. With that, what kind of scoping would you like to see? And so now that we've got the scoping, I think bringing back a more substantive analysis is what would feed the kind of conversation that I think as policymakers you were sort of more inclined to go to, which is, so I have questions about the data. What can you tell me about the data to inform some decision-making?
Does that argue for coming here or going to council with that report, though?
I think I'm wondering if going to council to talk about scoping is really that helpful, because I think where I heard you going as policymakers was to inform decision-making more than scoping, was where I heard your tendency to go
So if we
tonight.
had an updated report on the 20th with an idea to just kind of proofreading it, not really having substantial changes on the 20th, could it go to council on like the 26th? So you basically would have it agendized and teed up with, you would get a little maybe feedback and proofreading from us.
Late packet on the 22nd. You could do a late packet on August 22nd, which would be that Thursday, so essentially, in terms
Yeah.
of the difference, we can add a cover memo that summarizes the finance committee's
I think
discussion.
the understanding
and-
would be
and
that
the-
we're not going to make substantial changes, right, on the 20th.
Minutes wouldn't be available necessarily for the full council, so they would need to watch the video. Or obviously, we will summarize the conversation, but if they wanted the in-depth, that would.
I like that.
Okay, all right. And then, so getting back to future agendas, so are we canceling this August 6th meeting in general?
I would appreciate that.
Okay. And then the only thing we have on the 20th right now is this follow-up?
That's correct.
Will we have anything else? You know?
Most likely not. Typically, the first report out of the gate will be reports about CalPERS and our actuarial reports, but we don't receive those until August, so those typically are not transmitted until September or October.
When are we going to start the service performance analysis?
We'll be working on the schedule of that in
Yep.
July, so next month, over the course of the next month with the departments. So we'll be able to define that for you, I think, in August, kind of lay out a schedule going forward.
Great. Okay. I think with that, it's meeting adjourned. So, thank you.